Hello, everyone. I'm Randy O'Brien, co-editor of Studio Potter. I'd like to welcome you to become a part of the Studio Potter family by heading to studiopotter.org, where you can access our content and archives, and where you can see options to become a member or donate. I'd like to thank you all for joining Studio Potter for another installation of our author chats. Richard Zane Smith is our author chat guest and a Wyandotte artist who now lives in Oklahoma in one of the original Wyandotte settlements. In our April 2022 issue, Richard wrote the article, Rootedness, the Power of Peace. I visited with Richard remotely to learn a bit more about him and his studio practice. Richard's personal artwork draws from his ancient Wyandotte heritage, as well as many traditional Southwestern pottery styles, including the Navajo and the 8-chip Puebloans. He is active in the Wyandotte culture revitalization, longhouse ceremonies, and has spent many years teaching Wyandotte language and storytelling in the Wyandotte Public Schools. Richard, thank you and welcome to our Studio Potter family.
Tijame. Kweo materu sohahio ijatse Richard Zane Smith. De Rome de Wyandotte, jatu etan ne quatra sayomene koyeti. I introduced myself in the Wyandotte language. My name and my longhouse name is Sohahio, which means he has a good path. It's a name my mother chose for me. And it also, I'm just said I was a Wyandotte man here in northeast corner of Oklahoma. And this is where, where we've been for the last 17 years. So.
Oh, lovely, lovely. So your home has been there in Oklahoma for the last 17 years. And on the phone, we've talked about, it seems like every day you're out walking about 3 miles out on your property. Were you able to get your 3 miles in today?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, I just don't feel like the day's really, right unless I get that walk in there. And yeah, it's kind of a nice time. First of all, it's something I do just because I feel like, this is the only body I have. I'm 66. So see, and soon to be 67. And I just feel like, I need to take care of this thing. I just feel like that's kind of part of my responsibility. Not only to teach and that, but also to be a good example with my health too, and try to be an example of that. Yeah. So that's really important. Plus, it's a time where I get out and get to practice too. I practice out on the property here. I can sing as loud as I want. Yeah. Yeah. And nobody's gonna, what the heck, so. It's great time in the morning.
I was wondering if you could describe your property for us. I know you kind of have a vast space there. I was wondering if you could just kind of tell our readers where you're at and what it's like there.
Yeah, it's kind of like the foothills of the Ozarks where we're at here. So, we have a lot of different kind of terrain. And in fact, we have 120 acres. So part of that is along a beautiful creek that flows it flows all the time in a good year. And sometimes it dries up halfway, down. But we have springs. We have some beautiful springs. One is just a gushing spring. And so I'm able to, to go down with the tank, with the tractor and, fill it up. It takes 45 minutes to fill a 350-gallon tank, just with a hose. And I mean, the spring is, you don't even know there's water coming into the tank. There's so much water coming in. So it's beautiful. There's ferns in the summertime in one spot. We have this real foresty area that's just looks like a rainforest, in the springtime. And then the other parts are very dry. So you have these little stunted, little oaks, the kind of the blackjack oak and post oak and a lot of hickory but with a lot of fruit trees. So, the traditional, the mulberries and the.
Well, you were talking about the walnut. That was one thing that I was going to ask you. With land that vast at 120 acres, you have so much space and so many resources. And when we were talking about connecting for the author chat, you had mentioned walnut tapping for like syrup and sugars, I'm assuming. And I've also seen from your social media feeds that you do a variety of other woodworking that comes from your land, like making arrows, making bows. I was wondering if you would talk about being an artisan, and how you kind of came to be a maker. Give our readers a bit of a breakdown about those resources, the different types of wood that you have access to, and the other things that you make beyond ceramics. We'll get to the ceramics part, but I like
Okay.
hearing all that you do.
Yeah, I think ever since I was a child, I was always making things, and it was just something I think part of it had to do with the fact that I didn't go to kindergarten, so I was just kind of dropped right in first grade, and like it seemed like all these other kids knew stuff that I didn't know, so I felt really stupid. But I did fine once the art cart came in. It's like, oh, oh, because when I grew up, my folks, they would read to us kids, and so with the five of us, all five kids, we'd all sit around this little table, and they just take out the classical books and read books to us. And sometimes we'd be paying attention, and sometimes we'd be in our own little world drawing. And so that's kind of how I was raised, so drawing, sketching. And then I got into these little projects where I started actually like how to make a train out of spools, wooden spools. And so, I have a detailed how to, you take these, you saw this part, and I started making these little books of how to do this and that. So I've always been making things, and that just went on, it just continued on. And the woodworking to me, as a ceramicist, the woodworking is kind of like the reverse. With clay, you're building coil by coil. I build coil by coil. With woodworking, you're carving away. So sometimes to run from one to the other is kind of a good exercise. So making a bow, I have to split the tree. I have to take staves out of there. I have to trim them down. And, the bow that comes out of there is so small compared to the piece of wood, so it's kind of a reduction process. So it's almost like a good balance for me to work on both those things. So yeah, on our property here, we have, mulberry, which makes a beautiful bow, and persimmon. We have hickory, we have a Kentucky coffee tree and things like that. So there's just, and I like to be able to just kind of walk to the tree, and then, because we have a little ceremony, when we cut something like that and it's going to be used for something like that, it's, you want to be able to give thanks to the tree, and you give thanks for what you're doing, and you put some tobacco down, and you speak to it as a brother, and you say, why don't you come with me? You might die out here by yourself, so I'm going to take you home, and you can live with me, and we can work together. So there's just a little conversation with the tree, and it's all about restoration here too, revitalization and restoration.
Yeah.
There's so things we could go on in that, but making drums and rattles for our ceremonies, for our social dances, that's just part of it too for me. And just like to be, my hands in there.
Yeah. Well, speaking about the revitalization, you've also mentioned to me that you have recently been advising the Wyandotte cultural specialist for the Wyandotte Cultural Center, but that isn't necessarily a new role for you. You've been working to provide education to Indigenous communities for language recovery, among other revitalization efforts like storytelling and pottery classes for adults and bow making, like we've said. Song and dance. I was wondering if you could talk about those efforts to reclaim those lost practices. I feel like you've had kind of a lifetime of, cultivating and offering that, but maybe give our readers a little bit more idea, a more of an idea of what that revitalization looks like for you.
Yeah. Boy, part of it has to do with an awakening within myself. The fact that when I was going to Kansas City Art Institute, when I was younger, a 20-year-old, I was able to take my bike and go down to the Wyandotte Cemetery where my ancestors are buried, and to hang out down there, and to see those stones with those names on it, and to just to connect with that really helped me. And I always had sort of a strong identity, connecting with my ancestral roots, and knowing the stories about Tarhe, our chief spokesman for the tribe, a chief, that was really important in many, for many treaty signings and that kind of thing. He was a great grandfather, so to have that and to know that I kind of think I'm seventh generation from him too. So it's kind of like, this is real important to me too. It's like, I'd like to really make him proud. I want to make him proud. He was just an amazing man, and then people had a lot of respect for him. And so, the more I learned, I started asking for language material, so I didn't grow up with this, so I started writing to the tribe, and they'd send me. At that time, the Wyandotte Nation didn't really have a program. There was just, they were trying to get themselves together, even financially, trying to get themselves organized as a tribe that's respected by the federal government, and all that.
Yeah.
Here in Oklahoma. So they'd send me a list of words, and I started using those words in Sweat Lodge and trying to create my own prayers and things. I was doing the best I could, I really was. But I started getting so hungry for it, and more material started coming out, and then I started meeting people who also were interested in language, linguists, who were, and so it just, one thing led to another. And as I'm doing this, all these other tribes around are doing the same thing. The Miami people, are doing the same thing. So all these, the Shawnee, all these others around us. And it seems like there's always certain individuals in the tribe. There's always some who are kind of like the doers, the ones who are going to do the work. And there's others who are like, yeah, just tell me what to say. Just show me the words. I'll try to learn, do the best I can. So, but it does take some passion, it's got to come from deep inside, and you got to feel some kind of call for it. And it's just something it's always been there. So yeah, teaching the kids, when we first moved here, we just jumped in with both feet, I mean, we were like, what can we do? I'm learning the language as fast as I can. So I contacted a linguist who was helping, and said, I want to make some songs for the kids, because I know kids, songs that get stuck in their head, and
Yep.
so I started coming up with little number songs, or body part songs, like an arm song, something you could sing.
Yeah.
And then you could hold the class kind of captive, too, because you get them singing, they're not going to be messing around, while they're sitting there, because everybody else is singing, they might as well sing too, and
Yeah.
And it worked. I was just amazed. For 7 years, we'd do that in the wintertime. We'd tell stories. I'd tell a story for about 15-20 minutes, one of our traditional stories. And then, then we do language work with songs, using songs. So I came up with 20 or 30 songs,
Oh,
kids,
wow.
and they're still, available. I mean, we still bring them out occasionally. Hopefully more and more now that the Wyandotte Nation and our nation in Kansas, which is my mom's people, the more interest is, the more we can bring these things to kids, and it's important for these kids to hear this stuff.
And
so
I believe, did I see some recordings that you have online as well? And if there are, I can link some into this talk so that people can kind of see that song and play, or maybe not play, but learning through play. I think that would be a great example.
Yeah, and using puppets,
Yeah.
that's something I still use, animal puppets. And, it's kind of nice because in our Wyandotte language, there's not a lot of words. We don't have any P's, so, you can do a lot of language without your lips coming together, which makes it a lot easier to be of intelligence. You can just kind of sit there and talk, and, you don't even see your mouth.
Yep.
So it's
funny. Oh, grand. Well, I love hearing those stories, and I'll link some more content into this video for our readers and listeners to this, so they can kind of enjoy that as well. Speaking of kids and teaching kids, and then also you had mentioned your exposure to art, excuse me, came from kind of an art on the cart experience. I was wondering if you could speak to your exposure to sherds while you were in Arizona, where you were an art teacher at a Navajo mission school. And maybe you can give our readers a bit of an idea of how you came to pottery and the idea of kind of ancestral pottery.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I kind of got into clay when I was in high school, and clay, but I had a great high school, University City High School. It was excellent. And I mean, at that time, they had an amazing art program. I don't know what it's like now. That was in 72 when I was going there. So When I first started with clay, it was just, I was just fascinated by symmetrical forms, creating symmetrical forms, that just drew me in. And so obviously I got to the wheel pretty quick. I had to get to the potter's wheel, and I got addicted to that thing for years. I was addicted to the potter's wheel. In a good way though. It taught me a lot. And so by the time I'd left school, that's a whole nother story, but I ended up in Arizona. At this little school. I was actually visiting friends, and they said, you wouldn't want to stay on as an art teacher, would you? Because we have an art teacher this year, and that means these kids will have no art classes this year. And I'm going, wow, yeah, I guess I could handle that'd be fun, Navajo kids, that's cool, and these kids were, when they came, I mean, they're all fluent in Navajo. These guys, that's their first language, at that time, that was in 78, I guess it was 78, and so these little kids, and they gave me $50 for the year for art supplies, and it's like, well, that's the best I could do. And I didn't have money. I mean, I was living on the road for a year. I mean, literally, truck. So I came in, and it's like, okay, what do we do here? So I took $50. I bought some clay, because it's like, I didn't know about hand digging clay, and all. I didn't know about that stuff yet. That was still in the future. So I bought clay, bought some beads for the girls, because I knew they're going to want it, and some looms, I think some beading looms, and got them busy on that. And we started with clay. Well, the clay started running out pretty quick. So, well, I've been hiking around this desert every other day, and I mean, as far as I could hiking, and I'm finding sherds everywhere I go. Like, you see a little bump in the hill, out in the plains, you see this little bump, and you go there, and it's a ruin, and there's sherds everywhere. And I'm looking at these sherds, and coming from Missouri, you don't see stuff on the ground, you don't. Out there, it's like, somebody dropped this 500 years ago, and it's still sitting there. The sand just kind of gets pushed away from it. So it was so amazing to me, and to be able to pick up sherds and see fingerprints in them that I found out later were 800, 900, 1,000 years old. And you look, and there's this connection that started happening, because these are indigenous people. And I started, my ancestry started feeling, I felt the tug, I started feeling this tug coming, even though these were so different than my people, from the Northeast, but still they're working in clay, they're mashing it with their fingers, and I can see this. And so anyway, I was drawn to that, and I was drawn to particular styles that I'd never seen before, which is kind of a technique which I still use today, which is archaeologists call a corrugated type. And that's where you use very fine coils, small coils, and they shingle lap over each other. I didn't know about it at first. When you first find sherds, you don't know which way it goes. It's like, is it this way or that way? Until I started finding rim sherds, and then it's like, okay, I can see how these coils are laid on. You can look at the cross section. So, I mean, I'm just studying this stuff like crazy, and I started and I found clay out there. So then we're starting to bring clay back to mix with the commercial clay, to stretch it, and then eventually we're just using, clay that we find out there. And it was better. It was better than the clays. I mean, as far as shaping, and it had some problems in it. It had little gypsum crystals and stuff in it, which was a problem, but it was beautiful clay for hand building, and kids loved it too. So that's kind of where, hand building started for me, because I didn't have the patience for it when I was in high school, didn't have the patience for it when I was in community college or at university. So I didn't have a wheel, and I started just doing it by hand, and I loved it, and things started happening. That's kind of where it started for me.
Oh,
so kids got a lot of pottery that year.
Yeah. And so that was in Arizona. Then you spent some time in New Mexico, which is really where you began to dig deeper into the study of pottery, but also your ancestors. And you really, at that point, that's when you started making kind of replica art or reproductions of what you were learning and deconstructing from your finds. I was wondering if you could break down for our readers, and maybe from your perspective, the importance of learning through replicating and kind of deconstructing those ancient arts. Yeah, and then how, so there's like this phase of replication, But then there's this phase where I would consider you at, where you're taking that influence from kind of your ancestral forms and you're integrating it into your more contemporary work.
I actually started that kind of thing pretty quickly, but in little bites. And now in Arizona, just to clear it up, in Arizona, we actually spent 8 years there. I got married, and that I met Carol there at that school. She was a teacher, and I noticed how the kids just loved her. They're leaning on her during the recess times, and I noticed those things. And she was kind of quiet. I was really drawn to her, and so anyway, that spring we got married, and not having money, we were making $50 a month. Each of us were making $50 a month to work at that school. So we didn't have much. So we lived on the road for a year. We returned to Arizona, and we ended up in Ganado, which is out on the Navajo Res. And there she got a teaching job. It's a very large public school there. The buses go for miles to pick up kids in the farthest little reaches and come bring them back to Ganado. So it was there where the pottery started taking off, and it was not because of anything I did as making it take off. It was because I'm a terrible salesman, and I always have been, and I would still be a terrible salesman today if things hadn't changed. If I didn't have help from people who do that, like galleries.
Yeah.
But yeah, so so anyway, I was working on these corrugated pots that were almost like replicas too, replica type pieces. A little bit of my own, thrown in there, of course, but. And then I was firing them, and I thought, well, Herd Museum is having some kind of a show. Maybe I could sell one of these. Maybe I could sell one of these pots down. So I took it down to Phoenix, and I entered in the Herd Museum, and I went back home, and I thought I was going to have to make my living doing production pottery, right? So wheel throwing stuff, and I invested in. We had a little wood burning kiln, and I was doing glaze work and while I'm firing this kiln, I was like 12 hours into it, throwing wood into it. I get this call, and it was from the Herd Museum. It was from a guy who was one of the judges, and he said, I just wanted to call you. First of all, I just wanted to ask you, who represents you? And I go, I didn't even know what he was talking about. I was like, I don't know what that means. And he goes, well, let me tell you this. He said, your piece got Best of Pottery this year. And I just want to I'm a gallery owner, and I want to represent you. I want to buy your work, So this is where it started as far as this part of it. And then it was like, I don't know if I can do this for a living. This is hard. This is really hard. Right? This is not throwing on the wheel, which to me was so easy, it's like, oh man, that's just easy stuff. But so anyway, I made that. I said, yeah, that would be great. And I found clay that was nearby. And, so in Arizona for 7 years, the last 7 years, I was making a living doing this and going to shows, and the galleries were buying outright. And it was it was in the 80s, when there was all this excitement about innovative Native American artists. Artists with one foot in the traditions, but they're also exploring, and they're pushing ideas and not just being content, to kind of replicate what grandma did, but to continue and push out there. So I was doing that too. And I mean, some of my most early stuff was like, building a pot that looked like an ancient Anasazi pot, but it had cars all over it, on highways, instead of, the zigzags or something. So that idea was there, of trying to kind of push it, make something look ancient, and then throw you like, those are little cars on that thing. That's not a highway. This is a cloverleaf highway on the pot. That's just crazy. Yeah. So I was doing that kind of stuff pretty early. But when I started with the galleries, I thought, I'm going to start with ancient stuff first, kind of build it this way. I'm going to take these corrugated pots, make old ones, make them look old, and then I'm going to start adding things to them, my own, very slowly. And I did that over the years. I have a slide presentation, a PowerPoint that just shows this every step of the way. Color changes, like, okay, I'm going to add a color. So typically corrugated pots weren't painted. they started to, back in the 1400s, they actually started kind of these broad white kind of patterns on the outside of bowls and things, but they're very crude. But it's like, if that continued, if that had continued, that corrugated painting, I'm kind of wondering if it might have gone the way I'm taking it. I'm kind of like, but it somehow died out in the 1400s. This style was not done anymore. And so anyway, that's kind of where it started. And then we moved to New Mexico because we decided maybe it'd be nicer to be close to a gallery, and instead of making these long trips, we could be. So we looked in, for property around, first in Scottsdale. That didn't really work too well. So we ended up near Santa Fe. So, and we had a gallery there. So, and we had a little acreage, and it was on the side of a mesa, beautiful mesa there in Glorieta. So that's where we were there for 16 years. And the kids were, although they were born in Gallup, both of our kids, they were, and started their life there in on the res. They grew up there in Glorieta, New Mexico, and so that's kind of where the art began to. Well, that's where I also started, like you were talking about. I was starting to check into traditional pottery. I didn't know Wyandottes made pots. When I grew up, all I knew was that Wyandottes came from Ohio,
Yeah.
I didn't know where they were before then. I didn't know they'd only been in Ohio 100 years, and before they were forced out. I didn't know that. So I started finding these ancient pots that, not that ancient, 1600s, 1500s, and they were making pottery then. And so, because I was always telling people, they'd say, well, what kind of pots are you making? Wyandotte pottery? And it's like, oh no, Wyandottes didn't make pots, they use copper kettles, So I just didn't know. And I started researching that. And again, the first thing I started doing is making replicas, and just we cook outside, cook some steak or something, and then while we'd eat, I'd put a pot upside down on the grill. By the time I came back out, it was nice and hot. I'd build a fire over it, and it was fire. That's how I started doing it, just like that, and it worked. So so then I started, like, maybe I can incorporate some of these patterns, those scallop tops, that into my, my corrugated stuff too. So I started doing that, and man, I started really like, this is me, man. This is really me now, because it's got my corrugated, that it's become such a part of my life, the tiniest corrugations, and it's got Southwest meets Northeast, and so it became real exciting. It still is, really.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about, I guess, some of the conversations that I've heard over the years, and craftsmen and potters often kind of get stuck in this like conversation about semantics, I guess you would say, traditional art versus revivalist art, and so on and so on. And one of the things that I've kind of pulled away is that traditional art is often considered something that's handed down from great grandmother to mother, daughters, and on and on and on. And some locations like in Chile, Victorina Gallegos, she's from Quincha Maria, Chile. Her village, there aren't any more daughters who are really staying in the village anymore. They're all going to the cities to make money. And so the traditional patterns and techniques aren't really being handed down, and they're concerned that the traditional art will be lost. And I start thinking about these generations already that have experienced that, where the families have moved on, the tradition has been passed on, and then you skip ahead 3 generations, and then there are young artists like maybe myself who are wanting to bring back those skills of their ancestors, but there's really a disconnect in that traditional handoff, and so you almost need the revitalization of that art. And I guess for me, because I am of mixed race, and so I always feel this push and pull of, do I have ownership, do I have the authentic voice to be able to do that? Because there's a disconnect, there's a timeline of disconnect. And I was wondering what your sense of that push and pull is between that kind of disconnect. You're really talking about that. Some of those traditions have been lost and set aside, but you're really bringing those back. What's your experience in that push and pull, and for young makers who are wanting to get back to that kind of ancestral DNA, like they know they have connections, they can feel it, but there's this uncertainty of how, and that push and pull, I guess it's just that back and forth, how you navigate that.
It's a sensitive topic, and it's one of those, it's yeah, for some people it is really sensitive. It was for me too, because when I first started doing shows, I mean, I'd come down to Scottsdale, and I'm showing with Navajos and Pueblos, right? And it's like, then there's me, and it's like, so you kind of have to win yourself into and one of the things that I've told people too, we have a lot of Wyandots who are blonde, blue-eyed, very light skinned, and it's like they're tribal members, they're proud of their heritage, but when they go to powwows, they're often scorned, or they're looked down at, and there's that kind of, and they feel it, and they've been feeling it their whole life. You know what? Now that our green corn is established again, when we start doing our ceremonies, when we're speaking the language and those things, and they can sit there, or they can do the dances, they feel at home. They feel a warmth, that they're being accepted, because we know our families, we know our families. But when you go outside of those families and you go into the world, you go to a powwow or something, all of a sudden, you got the eye. And I understand that. I do it too. I'm the same way. People come up to me and say, I'm a Wyandotte too. I'm one of those Wyandottes that stayed back in Ohio, and we kind of go, what's your family? Because that's what we ask. If we know your family, we'll figure you out. Our tribe is small. This is not like Cherokee, who are like so huge. These are small families. We can figure you out if it's real or not. But it's been, I mean, I had an artist's wife at a gallery once come up to me, and she's questioning my heritage, and she goes, so how much Wyandotte are you? About this much, showing her little finger, and it's just, and it hurts, it kind of hurts, because you just go, I don't know how to answer that without being really nasty, or just, so I had to think about it. It's like all night when I was there thinking about that in Scottsdale, I couldn't sleep, because it's just like, that really hurt, but I don't know what to say about that. I mean, she wasn't necessarily being mean. She wasn't trying to be mean. She was trying to be funny or cute or something, but those are things that hurt. Yeah. So in some ways, I feel good, because I've endured some of that stuff. Yeah. and I understand it, and I understand the skepticism. And what I tell people who are from our tribe and who are, very light skinned and whatnot, I say, learn your language. When somebody gives you a hard time, just start responding to them in the language, and there's a way to do it. You can use your language, start talking that way. This is who you are. You're Wyandotte. You're not Indian. It's like, you don't have to try to become Indian. Just be yourself, be Wyandotte, or be Shawnee, or, all the tribes around this northeast corner are very mixed, racially. So, we're just used to it now, and for the most part. So it can be tough. It can be very painful to people who are made fun of, and they don't even want to come to a dance because, somebody might be there who gave them a hard time. And so we're trying, if I can lead the way, for people like that too, the ones who are actually tribal members who, maybe they don't fit the stereotypes anymore. And, it's like, if I can lead the way and say, you know what, you have just as much right to be proud of your ancestors and to speak for your ancestors and to do, use your language, grow the foods, you have just as much as anyone else, and, but it is tough. It can be really painful. Yeah, I've just had to push through it, and
yeah.
But like I said, I don't know if it's arrogance or just self-determination or what, but it's like, no, I know what the goal is. I'm going there, I got to go there. So I don't care. You can give me a hard time. You can trip me up, but I still have to get there.
Well, and I think it comes back to your earlier conversation where you're talking about the language, where you just kind of have to have this self-confidence to be able to dive in and be unfamiliar and uncomfortable with the language, but that's the way you learn, and there's a certain confidence that comes with just diving in and going for it. So I hear you on that.
Yeah. And when mistakes come, and I hate failures, I hate failures. But then I also feel this, I feel like it's my responsibility now, if I have students, to help them not do that. Some teachers are not like that. They'll say, just let them make their mistakes. I'll just
Yeah.
sit here. It's good for them to make mistakes. My feeling is they're going to make mistakes. They're going to make mistakes you didn't make. So why let them stumble on something that you found out works? It's like firing outside, out in the open.
Mhm.
You know how to do it now. You do it without losing pottery. Pots, they don't crack. So why don't you share that with people? What is, and we're going to get into this because I don't know if you want to talk about competition now, but it's a big thing for me. It's something that I've really struggled with. I don't, I got my reward, at Herd Museum, and maybe competition is for the youth. Maybe it is for the young ones who are trying to get their foot in the door. They're trying to get noticed. But I feel like it should stop. Once you're paying bills, that we really need to back off. Those of us who've we're established. Why do I need to enter pieces in a show to win awards? To me, to win an award is to take away something that somebody else could have got that maybe really needed it. Mm-hmm. So I refuse. I won't go to these shows, that are competitive. I won't even show up. I mean, you don't have to, there's shows you can go to. It's like, well, you don't have to compete. And it's like, yeah, but I don't even want to go here because I know that there's so many people who are. And this is not a native way. This is not our indigenous way of competing with each other that way. We have competitions. We have lacrosse. You want to see some serious competition, watch a lacrosse game. You want to see some serious, do a bowl game. Come to our green corn where we're doing the bowl game, during the peat seed. You watch the competition from the North Side clans and the South Side clans fighting, with the peat seed bowl.
Yeah.
That competition, we have a place for it, but it's not in the arts. It's not, it shouldn't belong there. I felt like it's corrupted a lot of people, and it's made enemies out of so many friends because they're competing with one another now for shows and awards and ribbons. And, and I'm really strong about that. And, I know there's a lot of people that totally disagree with me and they go, I love the competition. I love it. Yeah, well, I guess that's fine. But I kind of feel like it's actually turned the art world into, now we're trying to please judges.
Right.
I mean, there's pottery that Maria Martinez would have made that wouldn't even be accepted because it's not perfect enough, in the shows today. It's like, well, that's got a lot of flaws on it, and yet here she is, So,
and the process of judging is such a subjective format. So it depends on the juror that you have that year. And and I think when it comes to those, this is just my kind of like shooting off the hip here, but when it comes to those types of like art competitions, it seems like a very European thing that kind of came over with that kind of classical style of art, that I'm not sure if it necessarily is the right path for all artists, because art isn't about the competition, it's about the expression. And when you try to value expression in better than, in some sort of hierarchy of better, then it becomes very, the motivation is, I don't know, it's questionable for why you would want to praise somebody's voice of expression versus somebody else's. It is curious. Sure.
Yeah, for some years now, I've been going down to New Zealand, and spending time with the Maori down there. I've probably been down there. I mean, when I go, it's like 2 to 3 weeks at a time, and with artists. So we do shows together. We work in a tent together. We're out there, we eat together, we sing, we do all this stuff. And I mean, you're totally immersed. And then they do a show afterwards. Yeah. And I've come to the curators of the show, or the ones who put the show together, and I go, you guys, I am so happy to see that you guys don't have awards, or you don't do who's winning, or you don't put ribbons up. And they look at me like, why would we do that? We show our seasoned artists with our young artists. We want the young artists to be brought up. We want that's why we put them alongside the established artists, so that their work is seen together. Yeah. Why would we want to compete? So to me, it was so refreshing. And I mean, they even have Maori market, just because, and it's inspired from, the Indian market, but they don't compete.
Yeah.
They did not do that with judges, and I hope they never do.
Yeah.
There's always a tendency for those things to creep in, but hope for now anyway, they refuse to do it, and it's wonderful to go to a show and you don't have to worry about that stuff. Don't even think about who's on top. Who's on top, or after the shows, and you get all the people posting their art with their ribbons, and all that. It's just like, oh my gosh, I mean, like I said, maybe young people need that. But anyway, I've heard some of the older Pueblo people say that too. It's like, yeah, I don't compete anymore. There's no point in it. I don't need that. So it's like we all those seasoned folks can, if we could just back off, let the young people,
Yeah.
if they have to, it's like, if you have to do a competitive thing, just let the young people do this.
Yeah.
Maybe it's age limit or something, cut off. Well,
Right.
we talked about that. It's not traditional to put one person above another like that. But it is traditional to honor somebody. So the First Peoples Fund, which does an amazing job. That's what they do. And you can't apply for, it's like, oh, I want to be honored by the First People Fund, so I want to apply for it. No, you don't get in that way. You have to be nominated. Somebody has to say, well, what about Richard? How about him? And they'll say, well, what do you think about him? What is he doing in the community? And see, that's where you're honored. It's like, well, what are you doing in your community? Not just, what are you doing for yourself? And how great my art, how great my art, how great my art. So, so it's, when you see things like that happening, that's a traditional way to honor people. Wow, look what they've done. They're teaching, or they've just been one of those elders who's always been there for people when they need, to be able to just share with somebody and tell their problems too, and or give them some instruction on, like you were talking about, traditional things, which we didn't really talk about the idea of when you have to skip generations and that kind of thing.
Well, I find that I know that's one of the things that I personally struggle with, because I know from my personal ancestral background, I can trace back where my ancestry goes, but there's a big skip in the middle due to, family trauma, that I don't have a really strong connection with, 3 generations, dislocated. So I know it's just a pressing thing on my mind as a maker, and thinking about being a student, and then also being a teacher, how you juggle that, or how you navigate that with grace. And I personally haven't found a solution, but I know that's something that I think you work within, because there are those disconnects between the kind of ancient works and then making now. And I'm not sure that there's a right answer. I was just curious to hear your perspective on it. But
I think it is something everybody has to kind of figure out for themselves. For me, it's like, I have my ancestors inside me. I mean, I know they're in there. I don't mean it in a weird way. I mean it in my DNA. They're in there. And it's because we know now that DNA has memory. It contains memory. Otherwise, evolution wouldn't even work. Things don't evolve unless there's some memory to take it to the next level the next time around. So we know it's there. I think some people are more in tune to it. And I don't know how it is, but it's like the first time I heard Wyandotte being spoken, a recording that was made in 1911 and 12. And I'm listening to this old man speak. And, those old wax cylinders are like, they have that horrible, but you hear this person speaking the language, and you've maybe seen it written down, but then you hear them. Tanyon yeha, Tanyon yeha. And you go, rabbit. Wow, that is so cool to hear that. And that's a person who grew up speaking the language, and so it's kind of like you're listening to this through a tunnel, into the past. And these guys are just buried down the road here. They're just buried, the same ones. I have recordings that I'm learning the songs from these old wax cylinders. This is a good example of what you're talking about. They weren't continued. 1911, 1912, these elders decided they would share these songs with this young whippersnapper that came down here, who was actually he's French Canadian, and
Yep.
he sat with him and he asked, and he paid him $1 a day, which was a lot, back then. And he would, and they'd sing for him in one of those old Edison things, and they'd sit there and he'd just say, whatever you want to share, whatever you want to sing, whatever song you want. And so these people would sit there and sing for him. And I don't know why they did, maybe it was for the money.
Yeah.
That would help. But it was also, they didn't feel quite the same fear about, oh, these things shouldn't be on recordings. They didn't know about recording. It's like, this is new. It's not something scary to them necessarily. It was probably weird, a little strange singing in a big funnel, but we're so fortunate to have those. We have stories, that were written by this guy. That were written in the language while the speaker was, telling the stories, and then he'd have his son and her son interpret. So, so we have a lot of that, which has really been helpful to show how language is put together. But there was a jump there, see, so it kind of went dormant, and I think that's the way to see it, it's that things can go dormant. It's like seeds, you hear about these. Archaeologists find a little pot sealed off, with seeds inside. Let's see if some of these will grow, and they'll put them in, and some of them won't, but some do. And then, wow, that's amazing. You got these seeds coming up that were ancient seeds, and they've been holding life for just that moment. So, you never know, you might be that person,
Well, you had written that in your article, and when I was just reading, I wasn't thinking from an editorial brain, I was just absorbing it as is. And you, at kind of one of your concluding lines, you had talked about these kind of like dried seeds or dried flowers that are within us, kind of within our DNA, and all they need is this like moisture to regrow. And you almost like brought me to tears. I was like choked up because obviously you can see from the background here, I'm very interested in planting, and plants and harvesting and cultivating is something that's very important to me. So when I heard that, I just felt moved by the idea, because again, I keep thinking about this disconnect, this time, historical disconnect. And there, I feel personally, for me, you've really hit the nail on the head, that there are these like ancestral DNA seeds within us that just need to be recultivated, rehydrated, and to really bring them back to life. So I love that sentiment. I really do.
Yeah, that's one reason too why we talk about, revitalization is not just about language. It's not just about one thing or the other. It's all of it. It's like all these little seeds coming up in the garden. So, you have language, you have the arts, you have the singing, you have the dances, you have the prayers, you have all this. And what you're doing is you're getting as close as you can back to the way your ancestors were thinking. We can never completely think in the same way. Even the language we learn, we can put it together, we can figure out how it works, but it's still going to be a bit of a hybrid, because we don't have grandmother correcting us and saying, well, you're saying that wrong. You should be using this. And you ask them why, and they go, I don't know. This is just the way I was taught. See, whereas linguists they have to figure everything out. They're scientists, right? They're like word scientists, and they can do a good job. But it's, it'll never be the same because you don't have grandmother's touch. That's all right. We can live with that, because someday, we'll be grandfathers and grandmothers too. And we won't know, maybe we won't even know how we got to where we, why we're using a certain tense. And when even our linguist, who's been in it now for almost 20 years, and he's brilliant, this guy, he begins to, he's really cautious. He's very conservative. And he's one of these linguists that just wants to do it right, as correct as he can. And if he corrects you, he'll tell you why. And he'll show you an example of how he came to his decision. But he's never absolute about it. He's like, it's that, 20 times 20 to 1, this form was used, occasionally it was used this way, but you have that, and you make your choice from those things. And so it's important to be as conservative as you can about things like that. When you have people saying, well, I had a dream, and all the Wyandottes should gather, and we should do this and that. It's like, well, I don't know where that's coming from, but sorry, maybe that did work when people lived in a village together and we knew you. Right. We would know if that was, and we would send you to the grandmothers and say, is this person for real? We don't know. Right. You have people showing up, and it's like, well, sorry, we don't, that's not how we do things here.
Right.
It's got to be grounded in something.
Yeah. Yeah.
We
Well, and
don't
I'm
make
sure it's always that kind of balance, searching for that kind of conservative, concrete truth, but also still having the confidence to like know that you're going to make mistakes and know that it will likely be a form of hybridity, you know?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
So,
Richard, in all of our conversations, you strike me as one of the hardest workers I've ever had the opportunity to speak with, from making bows to making pottery to writing. You're a lovely writer, by the way. I really do appreciate your time and energy for myself and for the readers of Studio Potter. Um, is there anything else you would like to kind of close out with in our conversation here?
yeah, I would just encourage everybody, to look at your ancestral roots, to draw from. I mean, if people are really serious about their ceramics, instead of like going to Japan and saying, well, I just love the tea bowl, and I just connect with the tea bowl, even if you're not Japanese. It's like, why go back to your roots? First of all, there's a lot of things we like. I mean, there's a lot of stuff. I mean, I like, Brazilian things, and I like things that are from Africa too, and all this, but they're not, they're not rooted here. You can be influenced by them, but it's important. And I feel like the era before kind of the Christian empire stuff started happening, go past when everybody was hunter gatherers, when they just started, your ancestors started making things with clay. And that's where you actually start seeing a lot of commonality. You start seeing the spirals, you start seeing these patterns and things. It's like, oh my gosh, those people way over there in Romania were making pottery that looks like some of the Pueblo stuff. Yeah. Well, go to Romania. I mean, check those stuff out. Check that ancient European stuff, those cultures. Start there, start finding your rootedness there.